So again, thanks for this invitation. We find the site absolutely fascinating. It's obviously unique. And we also understand that the site is very important to the community, and you have lots of issues to contend with surrounding it. But we'd frankly rather be listening, but we do appreciate the chance to just share a few observations. We just structured this, and I hope to go very quickly through this, but just to give you a little bit of background on us and some relevant projects that might be of interest. Some understanding that we're gathering of the HRA site, which will be incomplete and imperfect, but just to kind of share what we know, what we think we know about it to date, and then some ideas for how one might think about it in a different way, perhaps through a master planning process.
So I'll just quickly introduce ourselves. We are a practice that has been 25 years in practice, starting in 1999. Our practice began in Wisconsin and moved to the Boston area in 2013. So we've been in the Boston area for a little over 11 years. And just to give you some sense of our roles and responsibilities, James and I are both principals of the practice. I am also a full professor and chair of the Department of Architecture at Harvard University in the Graduate School of Design. Dallman as a practice has been involved in a number of different kinds of projects in coastal communities with land use, very complex planning issues and regulations. And we've done a lot of things from architectural design to urban design. And if you might, James, just move to the next slide. Our clients are very diverse. We have worked with many civic and cultural clients. And again, we've done work from master plans to furniture, so at all different scales, and from civic buildings to houses. We are considered, however, a very small practice. We're an elite team in some ways. All of the people in our practice, 100%, are all trained at Harvard and come from some of the top programs in the country. And then what we thought we would do was share with you some of the, again, very briefly, because a lot of this you can look at through our website, but just to give you a sense of some of the types of projects that we've been involved in, particularly ones that involved complex planning. James, over to you.
So one of the examples is the Crossroads or Marsupial Bridge project in Milwaukee, which was on a site owned by the city, but had a number of advantages, including that it did not require easements or foundations to build a new pedestrian and bicycle bridge across the river adjacent to two very dense and growing neighborhoods. And the complexity of the project is hinted at by the various stakeholders that were involved, from the Department of Public Works, the Department of City Development, Wisconsin Department of Transportation, and a number of local stakeholders, including the Brady Street Business Improvement District, who provided seed money to help kind of jumpstart the project, which included connections to bus line, pedestrian bicycle access, as well as some civic space making. The project spans 650 feet beneath this existing viaduct, which was built in 1925. So it uses that structure as its host and is carried by it. So it required very little foundation work. So it was effectively a very cost-effective use of land and structure. The original bridge used to open at the center and was overstructured for a streetcar system that ran over the top. That was later welded shut and turned mostly to auto traffic, but that had some extra capacity to support this new structure. So this is just kind of calling out various pieces of the project, but the primary issue was to take an existing structure that had the extra capacity and sling this new pedestrian and bike bridge beneath it. The resulting kind of components of the project. And in the middle, it really started with this bus shelter, which was funded by the Brady Street Business Improvement District, along with a master plan study for the whole project. It has become something of an icon in the city. It's very approachable from both directions. It has public spaces at both ends, and these spaces have been used for a variety of obviously daily use for bikes and pedestrians, but also a number of arts and civic events taking place in these public spaces. The project really, again, started with the seed money from the local business improvement district, which drove a master planning process and the building of the bus shelter, bus stop structure, which was kind of the beginning and the gateway into the project. And that was leveraged for continued funding review and grant proposals by the city that we helped them write that went after federal funding through congestion mitigation and air quality improvement grants for pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure.
The project I just mentioned took about 12 years from beginning to end. So we're also the kind of practice that has the staying power to work through very, very large, complex civic projects and of long durée sometimes because of the nature of that.
Another project that's actually currently ongoing is for a pedestrian bridge, a shared use path bridge in Concord, Mass. And they had initially done a feasibility report to just look at sites to connect across the Assabet Bridge River. And they invited us to look specifically at the kind of specific design components. So this is an engineering report that they had done just to kind of test the feasibility, but they found it kind of lagging behind and they weren't getting funding for it, and they needed to kind of jumpstart it and push it ahead in a way that had more civic impact and civic consensus building. So we were asked to come in and provide a series of designs, review them with the public, and try to kind of build some more consensus around the project and more community engagement. So we presented 3 schemes: the crossing, the trellis, and the landing at different points along the river. And the crossing scheme, which is at the bottom, is closest to an MBTA rail bridge, and that provided an interesting opportunity. It's the one on the right in this series of presentation studies we made to the community in a public meeting. And we ended up with this, the crossing scheme, which is closest to the MBTA bridge and thereby retains the most open space of this conservation land. It's the closest to adjacent development. It's the shortest span across the floodway, and it was immediately adjacent to the MBTA bridge, which caused some complications because it felt very close and very kind of impacted by the train. So the plan included a veiled structure which shields it from the MBTA while providing some coverage underneath the structure. So this is a view of the current plans, which are heading into 25% plans submitted to MassDOT. We've gone through the initial phases of review, and we're at 25%. There's a shared use path, this veiled structure along the MBTA bridge, and a public plaza at the center span, which looks out over the river and creates a kind of public space, meeting space at the center span of the bridge. And this is a view from the MBTA bridge as you pass by the site. As I mentioned, this has gone through public meetings, workshops to kind of tune the design and pick a favorite and get the public engaged. Mass Trails grant and CPA funding was submitted and approved. There have been more town meetings to review more detailed design and more MassDOT funding approval, and we're at the 25% stage right now. This is really one of our favorites and perhaps one of the most complicated projects we've ever done. This is the granary project. It's a wood structure that was built in 1901 to hold grain for the community and for long distance shipping from upstate Wisconsin in a small town called Sturgeon Bay. It was originally one of thousands of local distribution hubs for grain that were spaced out at about 7-mile increments to make it close for farmers to get to in a day's ride. But there are now only 2 of these remaining on the Great Lakes. And this particular instance was saved for demolition by a community group that had it listed on the National Register of Historic Places. It's a massive structure, which is very simple from the outside, but with very complex interior, solid wood walls. We went through a master planning process with them and won a prestigious Progressive Architecture Award for the master plan design, praising it as innovative, as adaptive reuse. And this also helped them tremendously with fundraising and kind of getting the project out there. The project includes this tall ground floor space with new windows and converting it into a museum with a series of passages and staircase leading to the top of the structure to activate it for public use. We just completed phase 2 of the project. It was just opened a few weeks ago. It's now fully enclosed, has restrooms and support space, and is clad in reclaimed material from another granary that was being torn down in the area. It has new steel windows. And as I said, this was frankly one of the most complicated projects I've ever worked on. It involved many reviews with historic preservation officials at the state level, local coordination, DNR review because it's on filled lake bed. Again, the master planning, to kind of pitch this idea of a master plan, the master planning for the project really helped motivate a lot of the fundraising, the approvals, and in fact, the building had to be moved back to its site after being partially condemned before it was listed on the National Register.
James, I'd like to interrupt and ask a quick question. Could you go back to that beautiful image of the cutaway of the building as you redesigned?
Yeah.
What were the ADA requirements in regards to people accessing the building?
Yes, we have, because of the way the building's configured and its historic relevance, we have a limited ADA requirement, but we are bringing folks up to the intermediate level of the project, which is, here, I'll just sketch here. We're introducing a new floor level here, and that's a primary floor, and we'll have ADA access to that through an elevator.
All right. Okay.
And then to the upper levels, it's just too hard to negotiate an elevator to the upper level. So we came up with a compromise that meets code.
Now, has this been this is done now?
So phase 2 is complete, and that
Phase 2 has been completed, and we're on phase 3, which will bring the upper head house to life. So the ground floor is now open for public use, and they're holding functions there already. The building has, again, as James mentioned, has been brought back to its site. There's a very funny movie you can find online of the entire building being moved across the bridge. And it's been, as you can see, reclad, so it's weather tight now. And the goal is to get in the 3rd phase. This is actually staggered as well, partly due to fundraising issues, so that the organization that we're working with can actually build funding capacity in pieces to pay for it. So the 3rd phase will bring the head house to life by allowing the stair to reach that top level.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yep. Thanks, Grace. So yeah, we just had a soft opening for phase 2, which makes the building fully accessible at the ground floor. And the project was largely funded through a combination of large and small donations from individuals that was driven by the master planning process and us meeting with donors and presenting the scheme to them. We also helped the Sturgeon Historical Society submit for USDA funding through the state, and they acquired an additional $3 million, $3.2 million out of that state funding. So they had originally raised about $2 million through private donations, then about 3.2 through the USDA funding, and the remaining phase 3 work, which will include the elevator and the stairs, is about another $1.5 million that is being raised through private donations.
James, you should probably move a little more quickly so we can get to the other pieces of this.
Yeah, there's just some other projects we have ongoing, including some civic spaces for the Oneida Nation in upstate Wisconsin, some small scale housing interventions in Green Bay. But we're also used to working on coastal sites. So we're just completed a house in Sanibel, Florida, with a 13-foot storm surge that's already gone through 2 hurricanes, sadly, but is in good shape and is designed to meet those requirements.
It's a private home, I assume you're speaking about?
That's a private home, yes.
Yes, and one of the reasons we take on such a wide variety of work is so that we can in a cross-disciplinary way, really understand certain kinds of issues and apply them to the other types of projects. So we actually find that, for example, the coastal project is very much informed by some of the actual detailing work that we've done on projects like the granary or others, so that they actually cross-fertilize for the work that we do.
Thank you.
So I'll try to go through this very quickly. It's just kind of our current understanding of the site and what makes it so interesting, at least to us. The 1770s map of Boston Bay and Harbor shows the landscape with Hull highlighted on the right. But one of the things that I find so interesting is the unique landscape of the Boston Harbor being formed by these glacial drumlins, which is apparently in North America the only one of its kind. The bedrock, of course, we know is granite and different metamorphic rock, but at the level of the detail of the site, it becomes more interesting with this dense mix of hills and the beaches around Hull, and we find that the kind of poetry of those rock outcroppings as very inspiring. This is kind of a moment that I captured on the site. But you see this frequent outcropping of rock, of granite, as well as the larger kind of formation of the hills in the region, always changing with tide and wind. Likewise, the HRA land has been transformed over the years. We just noted that it's very interesting that it has had buildings on it in the past as an extension of the business district. It's not really virgin land. It's been, changed over time. But at the same time, that unlike many of the iconic conditions of Hull, the site doesn't seem to have a particular identity, at least as places that are named in Hull. This is kind of an in-between space, a transition between Surfside and Whitehead. So our current understanding of the site, the total acreage, this broad 530-foot wide space between the Salt Marsh Bay and the ocean. But we find it interesting also that within the short distance, the site shows a very interesting identity from the Salt Marsh on the road itself, the open green space, another road and the ocean. And I just took the series of photographs when I was out there last Sunday, that describe that kind of subtle transition from one space to the next. And the sheer breadth and the scale of the site is really spectacular. I happened to catch it on a day with a low tide. As a barrier beach, Hull provides protection from the aquatic zone, the habitat and salt marshes to the south, home for rare species. There's always kind of a reminder of the natural environment that surrounds the site. There's obviously links to historic Boston on the site itself. We noted that the local historic district to the north, the inventoried properties, and the national historic places, including the Hull Drive.
What are you referencing there, James?
The Hull Shore Drive being registered on the National Register.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that, so that's interesting.
By the way, we apologize because we obviously, we are aware that you know this site very well, and so please forgive us if we're in a way preaching to the choir when we talk about the beauty of the site and whatnot. It's just actually what inspires us, and we thought we would just share with you our interest in what we know about the site.
No, excuse me, I'm sort of appreciative of the fact that I just learned that Hull Shore Drive is on a list of historic places, National Register. I didn't know that.
Dennis, can I ask a question?
No, of course.
What is property, going back to that previous slide, inventoried property? I've never run into that phrase before. If it's not relevant, that's fine. I was just curious that some of the town seems to be inventory property and some of it.
It is interesting, and I don't know what the origin of that is, but it's obviously present in large areas, including some of the islands as well.
But I believe what it partially refers to is that, so we did a lot of these maps, doing a lot of work with GIS, and GIS obviously as a database collects information about any kind of property, and it's a little bit of a crude instrument in the sense that you can see here, like some of the line work around the actual areas is a little bit rough, but it's super helpful to understand what has been mapped in general terms and the origin of it. And certainly any of these other, what gives us more information as you zoom further and further into any particular site, you can actually dig up quite a bit of information through GIS.
Yeah, this is all from ArcGIS, and it's also registered on mass government websites.
And then we overlaid in many cases some of our own coloring of to make the diagram a little bit more clear.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
We've also, just looking back at some of the history, we know this site has a deep history and lots of activity, especially further south with the fairgrounds or the amusement park. That this linear layering of the site has been present for quite some time. This relationship between building and landscape, between the bay and the ocean. Just zooming back out and looking at recreation, that's a key part of the site, the site's history. DCR obviously has a lot of property and stake in this area. And I think that the kind of coordination with DCR lands and DCR objectives is kind of critical, I think, for the HRA and for your site. And I just happened to run across a really interesting little event. The dopamine dippers were doing their plunge last Sunday, and it was quite windy, and the surf was up, and it was pretty fun looking. Site access is obviously important for a peninsula. How does one get to Hull? Obviously, they have the car, ferry, bus, bike, walk, and all of those different circulation patterns obviously come to a neck through your site and become very critical. Bike trails seem to kind of terminate at the site at the moment, but you've got it would be nice to see the bike trail kind of like continue on. The 714 bus runs past the HRA site, but for some reason the bike kind of terminates. We just looked at what a 5-minute walk radius looked like, and to kind of give some sense of scale. And also it reminds us that the distance between the comfort stations is kind of a critical issue. We understand that the Hello trolley is no longer running, but certainly an interesting part of the site, and the potential for multiple modes of transportation through the site. Just zooming out again, obviously the category 1 hurricane, coastal hazards are a really big issue. And this is all generated from our GIS as well. Flood zones at the big scale and at the scale of the sites. 1% chance of flooding over most of the site.
That's very helpful just to understand what the relationship is of the topography, because it does actually look relatively flat, but in fact, one really understands it, it's technically a lower point where the flooding would actually inundate.
So we just did a quick GIF of the the future projections, current future projections based on GIS of storm events inundating the site. So next, just sharing some ideas. We know there have been a bunch of proposals and site studies completed since 2015, and there's a lot of really good information there. And we know you have some ongoing work with the road improvements. But we've also seen the surveys about walkable space, gatherings being two of the most important.
All right, I'm going to interrupt you here because I really just want to make sure. Where did the survey come from? Was this the human, the one that we talked with Erin about?
This was from, we got this up from the Hull Times.
Yeah, so
an independent poll.
I'm going to ask you guys to not to spend any time on this, only because it really, we talked about this at one of our meetings, and it's more of a, what we call a polling survey. So let's, keep to sort of a high level. If you,
sure. No, that's fair. Thank you. Thank you for mentioning that. We want to keep it moving and share what's relevant. I mean, just in general, some of our takeaways was that, there are kind of 4 major theses or 4 major themes to connect, to give Hullonians greater access to the Boston metro area, to respect Hull's history, native habitats, and public access, to protect the HRA site from flood events due to climate change and to sustain through funding and revenue for the HRA site. This is a quick overview of the site in 3D. Just looking at the key components, looking at adjacent neighborhoods and mixed use, housing and mixed use, looking at access, the main circulation patterns, looking at travel times, looking at the key the view sheds, and that cross section through the site is so interesting and gives you these views back to Boston and out to the ocean, as well as diagonal views up and down the coast, exposure to sun and wind. And this leads us to just thinking about conceiving of 3 public zones within the site, that each district has some identity and use based on association with the adjacent environment and the context. So it seems like there's recreational, civic, and natural exposure with some alliances with context. So there's more residential to the north, more commercial to the south and east, and more civic in the center. The gray zones could be more programmed or built out with more intervention, with a spine connecting them together and creating cross connections across the site. There's continuity of infrastructure potentially connecting the groundscape and the built form, boardwalk edges. And the result of this, or this way of kind of thinking about the site, is that there could be a greater sense of connection to the floodplain and the protection from flooding. So the beach in some ways is sacrificial. The outdoor zones can absorb some wave action and allow standing water to infiltrate soil, whereas the buffer zones could be a little bit higher and to keep the road and infrastructure a little bit out of harm's way. So one of the things that we just thought we'd mention is that based on the other projects we've done and what we see as being potentially of use for you is a master planning exercise. And I guess we would just summarize by saying master plan should recognize the potential of buildings and landscapes together, that where both are mutually valuable and precious. So this kind of notion that the site has an opportunity to do both. It has an opportunity to be open and developed in some way for public use. Framing and activating public spaces development can contribute positively to the economy, vibrancy, and civic life of the city.
We also thought we should share with you just some things that, because our research has been around public space and these many similar conditions in a lot of our projects, we thought we would just share with you some of the most inspiring kinds of projects that that we looked at, throughout the world, and again, just sharing with you some ideas that we've had. So, for example, we're really aware that public space and open access to waterfront is important. Of course, you see this already in developing some of the nicer parts of Boston that are trying to achieve this. Next, in combining both park and beach, these are again examples from all over the world, which we find interesting. Architecture in this case is kind of cupping the open land and connecting both the park on the left-hand side and the beach itself. In Florida condition where there's a very strong figural kind of shape to an open space with a lot of informal buildings. This condition where the architecture actually supports the civic realm. And then here, a public space along the water with multiple modes of transportation, as this area steps back, there's a lot of different kinds of mobility around. This is just an example of architecture in the public realm. How the planting of native species can, in a sense, rewild the site and actually help with a lot of evapotranspiration when there is a storm surge. How one might think about public amenities and multiple ways to inhabit, let's say, the edge between water and land and built form. And layers of use here in terms of outdoor promenades and porticos, in which case they could support some of the other amenities. Boardwalks. This was actually a sailing club, and it becomes a node. And then questions of integrated hardscape, which can then support other functions, from markets to other kinds of street festivals. And then again, just thinking about how the civic system of your waterfront might be layered, and how it also might support multimodal modes of transportation and gathering spaces, including amphitheaters. Embedding the buildings in the dunes themselves. And in
We
this,
thought this was a particularly interesting example of something that is kind of embedded in the landscape and related to this subtle space where you can look over things and integrate it with vegetation and habitat.
And then another idea of another project where the ground plane is almost lifted in a sense and tucked underneath. And then again, like just edge buildings and the ways that one can create integrations of paths. And then here, a community center that serves as a gateway. And then a second story hovering above, like storage for the site. And then viewing spots, community program that can serve as edge and is very porous on the site. You could walk through it. Just looking at loving natural materials for built projects on the site. And then thinking about pavilions that might be positioned along or situated along a circulation spine. And again, these are just some examples of the things that inspire us as we think about how land might be organized and used.
Just to touch a little bit on some ways that one might approach a project that has a master plan and has components that either need to be phased or funded through a kind of a public process. We've just been collecting some examples, and we won't go through all of these, but there are certain kinds of grant applications that are more focused on people and placemaking. That include coastal resilience, Mass Downtown Initiative, Commonwealth Places, Underutilized Properties Program, etc. Others that are about parks and recreation, like parkland acquisitions and renovations for communities. Infrastructure, like Seaport Economic Council, Mass Works, TIPS, Mass Trails grants, which actually we're engaged with at the Aspet River, Aspet Bridge project that we showed earlier. NEA Our Town grant, which actually we've been awarded a very large grant in the past for a research project, master planning project, an NEA Our Town grant, which can really help with design and kickoff of a master plan, community development funds, and CMAQ, which I mentioned earlier, which is one of the funding sources, the largest funding source for the Marsupial Bridge project. There are obviously other strategies, other frameworks through donor funding, public-private partnerships, community-driven corporations or mission-driven developers, the developer team, teaming with nonprofits and others, etc.
And the reality is that actually most of our projects that have engaged in the public realm in general have been a combination of all of these things. Usually they're quite complex beasts in the sense that the funding sources might be coming from different places at different times and then are also phased. So it can be quite a number of different mixed and matched conditions. And then we also thought we would share just some thoughts about the way in which one thinks about programming the site. And we know you have a lot of ideas about this as well, but here we were just thinking about the kinds of program that is useful to the public. It often requires some kind of private investment and or a small business to take on some of these activities. But in other cases, they're entirely brought to the site by the people who are using them or developing them as ideas. But there's a lot of things like around sports and recreation and food and farmers markets, carnival fairs. These are kind of like public events around arts and culture as well. Obviously, a site of recreation usually has availability of food. And then we were also thinking about other kinds of things like arts and culture. And these are, again, many of the types of programs that have helped to propel some of the ways in which one might think of a site. And of course, health and wellness, especially after COVID, people have really, really appreciated the relationship to their exterior space, their indoor and outdoor space.
Thank you for taking the time to hear us out and give us a chance to share some ideas. We're happy to go back and talk about any of the pieces that we presented or talk about your site or any questions you might have.
Adrian, why don't you start, and then we'll let Dan jump in, and then the rest of us can ask questions if we'd like. Adrian, go ahead.
Thanks. And Grace and James, thank you so much for coming and preparing this presentation. There was a lot of brilliant looking inspiration in there. You keep referring to a master plan. We have actually helped the town fund a master plan. Would you consider that's like sufficient if the town has a master plan that encompasses our land, or are you suggesting that we do our own master plan?
I guess the master plan, you're saying the master plan is part of the town has a master plan overall. We have helped fund, and I believe they should be starting any time now for a master plan of the whole town, which I believe will cover our land from what I seem to recall. Okay, so that hasn't started yet or is not complete yet? Definitely not complete, not sure if it's been started.
Well, it's that I think that's actually an excellent question because I think I'll answer in two different ways. On the one hand, one of the questions that we would have is what is the type of master plan that is going to be developed? Because a lot of times people use the term master plan in a number of different ways. So sometimes it's a zoning guideline or a planning guideline in which one might state that this can happen here and this can happen there and this can happen in one, so it kind of becomes a document that's a little bit more about deciding what goes where. When we've done our master plans, they've been very design based. So they've been really focused on being quite specific about what could go there, what it would look like. And when it comes to, let's say, trying to either gather philanthropic dollars, whether it's through private donation and or whether it's a kind of public grant process, the actual design really matters. And usually our clients have commissioned us to produce those designs partly so that they can leverage them in the fundraising process. So there has to be a design. So it's not like just a bunch of bubble diagrams on a map. That's typically, and so again, I would love to know what level of detail and planning the master plan that the town has undertaken or that is planning to undertake how far along it is and or what it really will end up producing. If the planning is not actually a design-based plan, it typically cannot be leveraged, or it has much more difficulty in being leveraged um, for philanthropic and or other kind of fundraising goals, because again, people are interested to know what it will look like, you know, what's in it. It's like more specific and it's more design based.
Yeah, it might be worth differentiating from between, say, an urban planning strategy where you, as Grace said, you kind of create zones for development, or a general street grid with certain types of building types or use types distributed on a kind of map with a wish list, compared to, I guess we might call it more of a concept plan, that it's a master planning exercise, but it's to create a very specific proposal, specifically addressing public need, specific building types on the site, landscape types, kind of a more of a draft design proposal, with the visual cues to let people know what it would really look like and feel like. So it's pretty evolved, typically what we're describing as a master plan.
Yeah, I would also say that one of the things that James and I and Brian and Una, who are also on this call from our office, were thinking about is that when we were studying your site, the reality is that there are a lot of questions that we ended up asking ourselves about the town, about the main street, about the difference between certain drives and the way the roads were working and or traffic patterns were occurring. So the reality is that it's, you know, one never does anyway a master plan in a bubble, because the, like we as we were just debating it internally, like we were asking ourselves, well, where is the appropriate spot to densify on this site? Where do we address the questions of housing crisis? Where do we address other questions of development? And part of us, you know, as we were looking through this, we realized that, okay, well, there's actually a lot of questions that are related to the town itself. In order to figure out what the symbiotic relationship would be between this, this particular set of sites and the rest of the Main Street, if you will. And usually, when we've gotten involved in a project of this nature, it's partly because, so that we can advocate for particular goals of the HRA, and the specific issues that might be related to your needs and your vision and your thoughts about this as an area. And certainly we've dovetailed with a lot of other larger master plans or adjacent townships or neighborhoods that are adjacent to the areas that we've been asked to develop.
I don't have many comments. I'm processing it. I mean, I haven't, I did not get a preview of any of this. And it gives us a lot to think about. Their approach is very broad in the, in how they're looking at it, and often we spend a lot of time, we end up jumping down too quick. Maybe it's because we were responding because we had this existing RFP that some of us didn't agree with, but it was they made me step back a little bit. So I haven't got too much to say about it. I've got a lot of. I'm thinking about what I just heard.
Clarifying question about these master or conceptual plan, because in my opinion, I think what the town is working on is the other kind, the zoning one. Is that something you do for like a specific organization? Like you would do a conceptual plan for the HRA with our guidance input, et cetera, towns and input, all of that? Is that how it usually works?
Yeah.
Got it.
Yes. I mean, typically. Oh, go ahead, James. Sorry.
I was just going to add that in the process of doing a conceptual plan, I'll call it a conceptual plan, not to change the terms now, but to differentiate it from more of a zoning plan. To do a conceptual plan, we would have a client, but we would decide with the client early on who the constituencies are. And so it should, I think, include more than just, frankly, just one entity, and it might need to engage some conversation, say, with GCR, some conversation with other stakeholders, some conversation with business owners immediately adjacent to the site, etc. So that it's more inclusive, as Dan alluded, and it's more high level. It's perhaps less predetermined what the outcome is, and maybe a little bit more build consensus and build a strategy out of the communication with the various stakeholders that are immediately adjacent to and on the site.
Yeah, and the reason that we showed you the Assabet Bridge project from Concord, Massachusetts, the reason that that's sort of an interesting thing is because what happened was in that public process is that an engineering firm started the project, and basically by about 2018, the project stopped dead in its tracks, and the public was in an uproar about not only the location of the bridge itself, but the way it looked. And there was a lot of dispute about how it should move forward. And so that's when we were brought in to do an actual design proposal and to really think about, well, there are 3 different locations that we could look at. Let's really, really design it out a little bit more so that we could understand the pros and cons of each area. So in that project, we went from looking at 3 different bridge designs. And the reason we shared it with you is because it was a method to engage the public and be more specific, and so that people could actually come to a consensus. So that by the time that we ended up making our more final proposal, we already were able to draw a significant amount of consensus from the public because they also knew what it would look like, since this bridge would end up in their own backyard. So we actually did 3 completely different bridge design proposals, and that was super helpful so that the community could eliminate one and really be clear about what they didn't like about it or what they did like about it. That public meeting process was really, really useful, and it also helped us in then trying to clarify with Mass DOT what the reasons are for why it was there and what the community felt was important, because Mass DOT didn't even quite understand what we were trying to do. So, we do think that we, for better or for worse, James and I have taken on projects that are, quite tricky in the complexity, but we're not afraid of that, and we feel, very proud of the fact that we've been able to bring together, again, very disparate views but through design.
Yeah.
And it's usually taking 2 or 3 schemes and comparing and contrasting them and looking at what works well for one scheme, what might work well for another, who benefits or why, and then rethink it again. So you do tests and then you rethink it and you combine qualities that are the best of the different schemes, and you kind of craft an argument and a design simultaneously with input.
First of all, we're delighted to be invited to talk with you about it. The site is spectacular. I mean, when just in our very brief research of this site, to recognize that it is formed out of these ancient glacial drumlins, which are really the only in this North American region, it is actually quite spectacular. And it forms the elbow to the entire Boston region. And that's very, very special. And I do think that in terms of the question of how you would develop the HRA lands and things like that, or how you think about it, or how you decided on where the landscape should prevail and or other kinds of modes of transportation. I mean, it's very exciting because it's actually such a special site, and there's really nothing like it left. So with Bartley's question about the MAPC work that is about to, most MAPC work is actually like kind of very plan related, like planning code and whatnot. So it is a little bit different than what we, just to clarify, as he was describing it, it does sound like it's quite a different animal.
I was going to actually ask this, so thank you, Bartley, for reviewing all those plans. It doesn't feel like any of them is quite the plan that is being spoken of, a like conceptual plan, especially getting like all the stakeholders involved. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think the HRA has done a conceptual plan like that, where it brings the community and all the stakeholders. It feels like this draft urban renewal plan like would have been or is that, could be that. But I found, you know, it might sound obvious, but bringing up the importance of having a conceptual plan that then has the design elements that could then get funding, like that is of particular interest to me, at least. And I guess especially, we all know how special the property is. So whatever we put there, like if we could make it as special as possible, and then perhaps the design is so unique in such a unique and beautiful location that it does bring in the funding, like, I don't know, that sounds like a magic combination to me. So it may sound like an obvious thing that I just pulled from what you were saying. You basically said it, but I just wanted to say it again because that's really what's standing out to me. That whatever we put there, let it be something as unique and beautiful as the property itself, and maybe that will help us get funding for what we'd like to do with it.
Just wanted, if there are people who want to comment on this, you know, you can send it to the HRA site. We'll read it. We'll pass anything on. So if there are people still on the call who, you know, want input, we'll take a look at it and we'll make sure that it's passed on and that we've heard you. Okay, I just